What's up, gamers? It's your boy at the Beef Dev. I think I've done that long enough where it's not just ironic. I just think I do now. Anyway, so this video, as you might have seen from the title, is something along the lines of things I wish I knew before I started sculpting in Zbrush, and that's exactly what this is gonna be. So first and foremost, I'm gonna be showing you this thing called PureRef, right? I don't I wasn't able to get the capture to work properly for ZBrush and PureRef, so I'm gonna have like a screenshot of what I'm talking about. And all that PureRef is this software where you could just drag and drop a whole bunch of images, and it's meant for artists, right? So you can have it in one corner of the screen, or if you have multiple monitors, in one monitor all your reference while you're sculpting, and the other monitor. That's usually what I end up doing, and it's one of the I'd say essential tools for any 3D artist or any artist in general that's working on a computer, because it's really useful as far as like the way you can overlay and you can mess with it, and it's free. So probably gonna put a link down below for some of the things I'm talking about, like PureRef. Next, okay, cool. So now we're here at the scene. This is the default solder. I turned off a whole bunch of the subtools, so you can see here, and I brought in this other anatomy reference subtool that I have. You can get it from Frank Grassetti's website. He's no, Raf Grassetti, yeah. That's the director of God of War. He has this whole anatomy model with like legs and all those things for free. So you can just download it and import it. It's meant for 3D printing, so if you have a 3D printer, you can also print it. If not, you just use it here. That's what I do. So the second feature that I want to be talking about is called split screen, right? So you go transform, split screen, and then one, and you can have multiple different things. But the way that it works is that, so I have these two models in the same place as far as like the actual XYZ location, and I'm selecting this subtool with the solder, right? And everything else that's like other subtools that are active, then you can see them. So I turned everything off for ease of use. And let's say that I want to start working on the pectoral muscles, right? I'm just add a little bit of geometry, and using this reference, it turns around whenever I turn around my model. So it's super useful. It's another one of those things that's I'd say essential if you're gonna be doing modeling. It's not like must have by any means, but it helps a lot because it's really easy to think you know what muscles look like or what your reference looks like, but when you're doing something anatomical, it's just an invaluable thing to have. Next, I'm going to explain what some of these things are up top that I didn't know what they were when I started, so it made things very confusing. So focal shift is one of those things. What focal shift is basically, there's this, like my cursor has like a red ring and then another ring, I guess, surrounding it, and the active sculpt area is only what's within the first ring, right? And it kind of does like a soft fall off, so you can blend brushes and alphas and all those things pretty much seamlessly. So if you want to change that for whatever reason, you want to have a solid, I guess, square or whatever, in this case, and then just change it all the way to -100. And it's just one of those things that you need to play with, and it's not like a one answer for everything. I usually have it at 0 and then start messing around from there based on what I like as I'm sculpting, and I tend to move it quite a lot. The other feature that I wish I knew is this thing is like a timeline. So you can just do Control C to go back, and you can see it move. But the thing that I didn't know at the beginning is that you can also click and drag it, so you can have it back to however many iterations. It doesn't save like a million iterations, and you can actually go into the preferences and change how many steps it keeps. I prefer not keeping a whole bunch because that's more memory intensive, and I'd rather use that extra memory for extra geometry. Alright, now that I've gone over those two tools, I'm gonna go over subtools themselves, right? So subtools, think of them like layers, and I wasn't exactly sure how to use them at first. And up here you can change exactly how many are visible at any given time. I usually have it at the default, which is like 11, I think. So I guess let me turn off split screen. Cool. yeah, so it's basically all of these are divided into separate layers, and I turned on the solo mode so that I could pass through them. And the cool thing about this is that it's much like layers in Photoshop, is that if I have the vest separated, I can just sculpt on the vest and it has no effect on the character model because it's a separate layer. So it's one of those things that I wasn't quite sure about, but it's not as intuitive the way that Zbrush handles it. Is the way you add new things is by duplicating and like oh yeah, for instance this, right? So I duplicated the character mesh, and then I went to like the C plugin, 3D print, whatever, and imported it, and it replaces whatever mesh you have. So you gotta be kind of careful because it's not super intuitive the way that all these layers work. Cool. So after that, then another thing that I want to cover is polygroups. So what's a polygroup? Polygroups are basically a whole bunch of polygons that are separated within groups. It's pretty, like it kind of makes sense if you think about it. So everything here that's a different color is a different polygroup, and this can be useful when you're like subdividing meshes or when you want to separate things. Like the way that I use it most commonly is that, okay, let's say duplicate. Right, so let's say that I only want to have this other arm, so I can do variant or I can sculpt a glove from it. Then I would do split and then group split, and I would split it into all the different polygroups, and then you can just delete what you don't need and so on and so forth. And later to weld them is just a matter of like merging down and doing a Dynamesh. Which brings me to my next thing that I want to talk about. It's Dynamesh. So Dynamesh is a good way of adding more geometry to the model, but if you do it, I guess the wrong way, you could say, or it's not necessarily wrong, it's just the default way. When you have models like this, it's gonna fuse the fingers together. So generally what you want to try and do is do zero measure to make sure everything's quads. In this model everything's quads, and it's a Dynamesh, and it also has the setting for blur and sub projection, right? So I'll usually turn blur all the way down because I don't want the mesh to get all muddy when I'm adding the geometry. And sub projection, it basically like if your object has hard edges like these, it keeps them. I tend to not use Dynamesh too much nowadays, maybe just to fuse different polygroups and subtools and whatnot, because it can, like, it brings up a lot of geometry, which makes it harder to work when you realize, like, oh wait, the shoulder's a little bit off, I only want to change a little bit, and now it has so many polys, it's gonna take forever to actually do it. Okay, within that, I talked briefly about zero measure. All zero measure does is that if you have geometry that has a lot of triangles, or it's just, let's say it has a whole bunch more squares here than here, it just distributes them evenly based on the settings that you put. I usually do something like adapt and 50-50 and start playing around, control C and back and forth until I have something that I like. Or in the case of where I'm trying to get a lower res, I just keep doing divide by half and half and half until I have like a reasonable amount of polys that still kind of keeps the object shape. Cool. Alright, so talking about a whole bunch of polys, let me talk real quick about this. So the subdivision levels, all that is adding more geometry based on the geometry you already have, and you can go up and down. I think the hotkey is Control D to go down, to go up, and there's another one to go lower, but I can't remember it right now because I usually just slide it manually. And what's really cool about this is that, so I have it all the way to 6, so it's comprised of, let me see, a whole bunch of polys, like almost a million pointers. So that allows me to sculpt like high detail things, like let's say I want to do muscle definition, right? Like then I'll start like using my damn standard brush, which you should be using a lot of your, like, trying to get fine detail or wrinkles or whatever. And also, let's say I'm doing this and then I realize, oh wait, the pec shape overall is kind of wrong. Then what you can do is you go to like a lower subdivision level, so it's way easier to manipulate. And then you can start moving the mesh freely, right? Because if you try and do that when it's the higher subdivision levels, it doesn't move as much of the mesh because it's a lot more polygons in the way, if that makes any sense. Right. So after that, another super useful thing is, so you press Control Shift, it changes into this different like selection tools. I always like switching to lasso by default. And let's say you want to work on like the armpit, right? How are you gonna work in the armpit of this character like this? So what I do is just Control Shift, and then be sure to select all the parts that I want to hide, like the arms, and then just do Control Shift and click again. Click and drag, and then it hides all the other geometry. All the geometry is not gone, it's just hidden, so it allows you to work in the underside of the arms and a lot of those hard to reach places. This model in particular, it's not great for making games or making characters because of its pose, right? So I would have to move the legs, and something that you can also do with the hiding things, although I wouldn't recommend it because there's other ways of doing it, is you can move the mesh a little bit to a different position, and this is why I don't recommend it, because you don't see how much you're moving it, but it can be done, and it can be useful in very specific circumstances, but I'll leave that to your discretion because every project's different. Cool, so that's basically the bulk of the main tools and things that I wish I knew when I was working on, and then just other things that I want to briefly go over is alphas, right? How does that work? So alphas in general, think of it like stamps, right? So let's say I want to get this arrow stamped to like a cool Avatar Last Airbender type of thing. So I click here, and it's gonna, well, first because I have my symmetry, it's gonna duplicate the arrows, right? And let's say, I don't know, I want to try and get it like across his chest. It's gonna make a continuous straight line because it's just multiplying it, because that's the way that this brush is set to work. So you gotta change not only the alpha but the way of applying the alpha, right? And by doing so, you have a lot more control. So here, for instance, let's do the Last Airbender thing. That gave me so much more control as far as being able to decide where it goes exactly, and clicking and dragging how big I want it to be. Another thing that I guess that I should probably go over is that with all these tools, they have the default mode, which is add. For the most part, some of them are subtract. You can change it manually, or say this is the add, and you can press Alt, click and drag, and it's the exact same thing, but it's inverse. So instead of going out and adding more to the shape, it like goes in. Cool. Beyond that, other things that have really sped up my workflow, I'd say, is setting your hotkeys, right? So for this whole time I've been using hotkeys, so I set up all my hotkeys for brushes. You can see they're changing, and it's just because I'm pressing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the most common brushes. 6, 7, 8, and 9 are my less common brushes. And beyond that, it's kind of the same as Photoshop in the sense of like parentheses to make your brush bigger or smaller, and that's the bulk of the things that help. Also, it helps looking up in Zbrush, like their actual website, the hotkeys that are default, like the adding geometry by subdividing. I always use the hotkey. I almost never actually manually go in and click here. But yeah, and a big part of getting good at Zbrush and getting fast at Zbrush is working with it, realizing things that you wish would be better, and then just modifying the UI to your liking, because you can change pretty much all of the placement of everything here. I know some artists like to have this whole bar in the bottom, some artists don't like to have it at all. It's just a matter of preference. There's no real wrong or right answer, it's just whatever works best for you. Well, so all that being said, I hope it was helpful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye.